Well, it's me again, and this is part two of the Christian peacemaking in the second nuclear age. It's a topic which I've dabbled, well, not really dabbled, committed myself for quite some time, close to 45 years of research, of writing, of active resistance, anything I could do to create an awareness of others of the dangers that the nuclear age has presented, and most people do have some sense of that, but they really don't. I think, well, they wouldn't necessarily meditate on the full range of challenges we are faced, and I suggest that part of that is we have families to raise and we have jobs to do, and for most poor people, who want to do something about this, they just don't have the time. And so those of us who are ordained in particular, especially deacons in the Catholic Church, are supposed to be active agents of bringing God's justice and peace to the world. But what often one finds is that the demands of parish life often pull priests and deacons and bishops even away from these essential tasks to deal with the day-to-day problems that people are facing as well. So often we don't get a chance to attend to the world in which we are all living, into which we minister in. But another thing should drive, especially those of us who are parents and grandparents and so forth, the future generations deserve a better world than we received ourselves. That is part of the human project, not to simply occupy time and space on this planet for X amount of years, but to do something productive, especially if one is Roman Catholic or even Christian, to make the world a better place for human beings. And of course, that's the role really of every human being. It doesn't really matter what particular religious tradition you are, or if you have none at all, if you're not even a believer. One thing we can do as human beings, though, is work together to make number one, the planet habitable the way it should be, and not allow the continuing erosion of our environment to continue unabated. To also do what we can to prevent nations from stumbling into a large war, which could be so devastating that our human imaginations really can't cope with it. So what I wanted to do is kind of continue with this, with reflections, first of all, beginning with President Eisenhower in 1953, his quote-unquote Cross of Iron speech, where he was looking at the present situation between, at that time, the United States and the Soviet Union in 1953. So I just wanted to begin with how he was looking at the world since 1945 to 1953. In making his assessment, he said in the 8 years that had followed between the United States and the Soviet Union and the dawning of the atomic age, he writes this: "What can the world or any nation in it hope for if no turning is found from this dread road? The worst to be feared and the best to be expected can be simply stated. The worst is atomic war. The best would be this: a life of perpetual fear and tension, a burden of arms draining the wealth and the labor of all peoples, a wasting of strength that defies the American system or the Soviet system or any system to achieve true abundance and happiness for the peoples of the earth. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fires signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat." This, I repeat, is the best way of life to be found on the road we've been taking. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. It is strangely familiar what he has to say. We know that despite all the things that have changed over these many, many years, that somehow, sadly, the threat or the possibility of nuclear war remains. Some have suggested, too, that the present situation is even more dangerous than when Eisenhower first uttered these words. The doomsday clock, which is the invention of the members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists organization, recently was changed to 90 seconds before midnight. That is the closest to midnight it has ever been. Even at the height of the Cold War, this was not that high. The question then is why? What compels them to move this so far ahead? Well, one is the growing challenges of climate change and the security risks that accompany these changes. Global pandemics and the impact it will have on food supplies, on basically employment, on access to drinkable water, and so forth. Mass migration from failed nations will again be with us in larger numbers. The increased famines because of crop failures, nuclear proliferation, both vertically, that is, present powers modernizing their systems with new and perhaps more dangerous systems, and horizontal proliferation, moving out to countries that are not nuclear powers today, but may soon become them. And as we said in the last session, when one nation in a particular region gets nuclear weapons, those other nations tend to feel very insecure. And so they have in some way been keeping an eye on possible new nuclear nations. And so they themselves would ramp up their programs to try to catch up. We know that in the Middle East now Israel has a monopoly on nuclear weapons, but Iran has been working on them for some time, as was Baghdad before losing the Persian Gulf War and when the Israelis in the early 80s bombed the Asyrak nuclear reactor. Now, this is something which is quite troubling. One thought that with the end, of course, of the Cold War, that nuclear weapons would kind of grow to be irrelevant. That, of course, does not happen. Instead, they are more deeply embedded in international relations due to the things we discussed in the last session. But we may want to go a little bit deeper on that. Why are they still around? Well, first of all, we know that once the bomb has been invented, you can't disinvent it. The knowledge is there to still create them. So those nuclear weapon states are very reluctant to just get rid of all these systems because they don't know if an adversary could in some fashion be able to reconstitute their arsenals very quickly. So that's one of the great challenges we have. I think one of the others, because the United States and Russia, which really possess 95% of all the nuclear weapons on the planet, roughly equivalent in their numbers with each other, have not gone further in their reductions. And so the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed by everyone in I think it was around 1970, from time to time we'll have, every 4 or 5 years, they meet again to talk about the treaty and how it might be enforced better. One of the provisions of the treaty, of course, is all the people who signed that treaty, all those nations, promised not to become nuclear powers so long as the major nuclear powers would disarm their weapons. So far, there has been some progress in disarmament, but those nuclear nations still want to hold on to significant numbers of these weapons. And so the other nations see this as a form of hypocrisy and what some would call nuclear racism. It's okay for the US and Russia to own these weapons, but not Iran or not Pakistan and so forth. There's this sense that that these powers are better able to control things. To a degree, that may be true. The United States and Russia and some of the other nuclear powers that have possessed these weapons for some years have a extraordinary command, control, and communications and intelligence networks that allow them to have fail-safe systems in place so that they will not be used accidentally. However, and I need to state that very emphatically, there have been accidents and near misses over the years that we'll look at in the next session, which really call into question whether or not, even with the most sophisticated systems, that somehow something might not go wrong one day. Now, the other thing, of course, is all the nuclear powers as of right now, as stated in the last session, are modernizing their nuclear weapon systems along with conventional forces. In many of these areas, we have some hot spots like India and Pakistan, which share a border, which have fought 3 wars. Both sides are moving toward diversifying their nuclear stockpiles. And Pakistan has gone one step further. They are introducing tactical nuclear weapons because they cannot match India in terms of conventional military forces. That would be tanks and planes and so forth. Now, this sounds hauntingly familiar. You remember during the Cold War, the United States often felt, and the NATO forces felt, that they could not match the Soviet Union's standing army in terms of numbers and their armored vehicles and so forth. So early on, they proposed to go nuclear during the 1950s and created a series of tactical nuclear weapons so that at the height of the Cold War, there were some 6,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Europe for the NATO forces. And of course, Russia felt inclined to do the same thing when they were the Soviet Union. They wanted to balance off any kind of advantage that NATO would have, and so they too deployed thousands of these tactical nuclear weapons. Fortunately, we never fell into nuclear war. But as we'll look at in the next session, part of that could have been that simply accidents did not go the direction they could have gone. And even in 1995, we know that there was a very real possibility that Russia was going to launch against the United States with about a 6-minute window to make a decision. So we'll talk about that in the next session. I think one of the things, too, is that as we've been studying the environmental challenges that are coming our way, all the military establishments of all the great powers in particular are looking at the economics and the security concerns about environmental changes that may require, of course, the use of military force. With mass famine, with the lack of sufficient drinking water in many parts of the planet, with crop failures, with the failure of certain nation states, mass migration, again, millions will be on the move. We have had a taste of that in the last few years, and we've seen how challenging that can be. But to imagine the numbers that we will be seeing in the near future is quite extraordinary. And so this may be a tipping point into armed conflict. It may not turn nuclear, but it can certainly be very costly. One of the challenges, of course, with India and Pakistan is that Pakistan's drinkable water flows through India. Should things get particularly difficult between the two nations and India decides to keep the drinkable water for itself, you leave Pakistan with a very difficult challenge. One, they're going to have to get water for their people. There's just no way around that. Second of all, no water, no crops. So it's clear that you would put a nation in the severe situation of having decided to go to war just to feed their people. That paints a rather grim picture in that part of the world because India kind of sits in the Asian subcontinent. It has traditional rivalries with China. China and Pakistan are allies to a certain degree. You have the Russia just above all that. It does smack of a very unholy brew. And so these are the kinds of challenges we face in the modern world today. Another challenge, of course, is the new weapon systems that are being developed, even the conventional systems. The United States and, of course, others, Russia and others, China, have developed hypersonic cruise missiles. Now, hypersonic means these things can travel at enormous speeds in such a way that an adversary may not know that they are going to be hit by such a missile until it's almost right on top of them. And so that reduces tremendously reaction time and a chance to deliberate on how one is to respond to such a thing. As we reduce the window of response time down from maybe an hour to even minutes, it does not allow the command structure of each country to make rational and calm decisions. Often the emergency or type nature of such an attack would often provoke perhaps bad decisions, or they may actually be perceiving an attack which really isn't there because these systems provoke this kind of tension. Second of all, many the movement into outer space, the United States in particular is very satellite dependent for its communication, not only commercially but militarily. Now China, Russia in particular, even India, and I'm sure the United States at times have experimented with anti-satellite weapons and satellites that can actually run into another satellite or grab another satellite. So the possibility that space may become a frontier for warfare is certainly in the realm of possibility and becomes increasingly so as technology begins to continue its progress, especially into space. Now, this is a challenge because we are very dependent on satellites today. And should those be disarmed, it would be a highly provocative act, and the United States might find itself in a situation they don't want to be in, nor any other country for that matter. The introduction of artificial intelligence into modern weapon systems could be very dangerous because if this artificial intelligence begins to operate free of human control, things can get out of hand very quickly. All of a sudden you start having visions of the Terminator movies, or you may remember some time ago the movie Colossus, the Forbin Project, where two computers, one Soviet and one American, hook up together and they decide they're going to run the world. The human beings aren't. And if you don't cooperate, we'll start detonating these weapons or firing them at certain cities. So that really is some of the challenge we face. The other thing with deterrence is that it only deters those people who want to play by the rules. Now, if you have a government, a regime, or you have, let's say, what they would call non-governmental actors or non-state actors like terrorist groups or others who have no fear of consequence, well, then deterrence really is pretty weak if it exists at all at that point. Certainly people who flew the planes into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon in 9/11 in 2001 were not deterred by any possibility of retaliation. So, deterrence only works so long as everyone buys into the idea of the cost risk benefits here. If you can gain something from taking an action, it's one thing. But if there's a big risk with a big cost attached to it, you may decide not to go forward with that. Some people may not make that calculation, or some groups may not make that calculation, in which case that would be very challenging. Now, these are threats to peace, but one of the most important threats to peace is the lack of justice among so many nations. As we said in the last session, what used to be called third world nation or less developed nations understand why they're in the situation they're in. Debt relief is important allowing them to kind of free themselves from this awful debt, which does not allow their economy to develop and to feed their own people. If these things continue, these nations get incentives to seek out the technology to try to level the playing field. So you'll see some of these nations grabbing for weapons of mass destruction, be they biological, chemical, or nuclear, and in some way to have some kind of bargaining chip with the rest of the world to be paid attention to. And you have to see this in terms of North Korea's activity. North Korea is a starving state. Its people are hungry, but the military is overfed with money and weapons and so forth. But primarily the reason why they've gone forward with a nuclear program is to maintain the regime. The fear that, without these weapons, that North Korea will eventually simply disappear because they will no longer be able to sustain and justify themselves as a government. And hence, maybe down in the future, the Korean Peninsula is unified. But that is abhorrent to the regime now in power, and so they will do everything they can to maintain their position. One of the great challenges, of course, of all this is nobody wants these kinds of confrontations and conflicts in the world, especially believers. And we know that we have to do everything we can to find ways to navigate through these very challenging times. In the upcoming sessions, we're going to look at, number one, how the powers have almost stumbled into war, to try to understand what we are looking at in the modern world. I think we need a good understanding of this, because if we're going to proceed with sufficient knowledge and to understand what we are talking about, especially when we're talking to people who are our political representatives, we do need to do the hard work of knowing the situation and some of the history of it. And then we want to get into, what is the Christian vision? What are the parameters of our own belief system that, number one, generates a spirituality for peace, that has an understanding about what God's concern is for human beings and how they might manage their affairs better, and how we might build a better world in such a way where the threat of these kinds of wars begins to over time simply diminish, and that ultimately we can free ourselves from the shackles of this really unfortunate nuclear quandary, but also in some fashion or another to delegitimize warfare. Well, we've got a long road to go, as we might imagine. It's not going to happen overnight. But little by little, maybe we begin to shift the consciousness of people, and that at least is a good start. So, until next session, I wish you well. We will continue on this. We'll be looking at so many different dimensions of this. That's why I'm putting this up on our parish website. Now, if I've quoted something and you want to know where I got that, you may send me an email. If you have things you'd like me to discuss in this series, I can certainly recalibrate things to do so. One of the things we're looking at, of course, we're going to look at the church's teaching on war and peace. We're going to look at the pacifist option, the just war option, what happened during the Crusades, and things of that nature, just to get a sense as to where we are at this point, and how can we kind of navigate through this rather challenging period of human history. In the meantime, take care, God bless, have a good evening.